Okay, so in the interest of time, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So I'd like to welcome everyone to today's meeting of the Catalyze webinar series, Beyond Technical Milestones, Incorporating Desirability into Your Medical Innovation. My name is Patrick Ahern with RTI, and I'll be helping out with the virtual room today. So please note, when you log in, your microphone and web camera will be automatically muted. If you have any questions for a presenter, please submit those into the Q&A window at any point during today's presentation. You may also click on the raise hand button and we can unmute your line to ask your question verbally if you choose. If you happen to run into any technical issues this afternoon, please let me know in the chat window and I can help troubleshoot. Towards the end of today's session, I will be putting a link to a brief feedback survey into the chat. So if you wouldn't mind taking a couple of minutes to provide your feedback, the project team would greatly appreciate it. Today's session will be recorded and will be available on the NHLBI Catalyze website. At this time, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Moline Pandiyan. Moline is an RTI Innovation Advisor with over 12 years of experience supporting innovators, technology managers, and company leaders in developing new innovations that lead to impact. She supports the NIH Catalyze program as a member of the RTI Catalyze Coordinating Center team, and also leads the medical technology sector practice within the RTI Innovation Advisors. Moline, I'll now turn the session over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. As I mentioned a bit earlier, we'll be using on occasion the Zoom chat box. So feel free to, as I do this introduction on this first slide, to type in where you're calling from. It seems like there's a lot of North Carolina representation, but would love to see where everyone is calling in from or zooming in from. As Patrick had mentioned, today's seminar is focused on looking beyond technical milestones and incorporating specifically desirability into your medical innovation. As Patrick had mentioned, my name is Moline Pandiyan. I have been working as an innovation advisor for over 12 years, helping innovators, technology managers, as well as company leaders, both large and small, bridge that gap between having an idea and moving it over to impact, either through new technologies or new products. I serve as a med tech or medical technology sector lead within the RTI Innovation Advisors, as well as serving as a member of the Catalyze Coordinating Center through RTI International. Next slide. The seminar objectives today is really focusing in on why is desirability important, as well as highlight techniques in which you, yourself, or your team members, or perhaps an external partner can help you engage the market, as well as incorporate critical stakeholder insights early on in the process, as well as introduce to you a new framework known as ICANVAS, specifically for medical applications, but also general new research technologies, which can serve to help guide you in terms of understanding what that innovation journey looks like from concept to impact. Next slide. Many of you are members of the Catalyze program, whether you are part of the NIH team or have been receiving funding from the Catalyze program. But since this is a recorded webinar and you might not be affiliated with the Catalyze program, I'll spend a couple of seconds now just to introduce at a high level what this seminar is. This seminar is the third seminar in a series of skills development seminars sponsored by the Catalyze program, which is housed under the NHLBI Catalyze program. The purpose of the Catalyze program is to support innovators to accelerate translational science, as well as provide various support services to investigators and innovators, either through funding or a combination of individualized or coordinated approach support. For more information about the Catalyze program, you can contact that informational email at the bottom of the page. Next slide. Today's agenda, as mentioned in the session objectives, is really going to focus on desirability, talking to you a little bit about why is that important, at what stage might you want to incorporate understanding desirability, as well as introducing you to that new framework known as ICANVAS. ICANVAS has been developed by RTI for several years now, but has since have added versions to help specifically medical applications and medical innovators. as well as providing techniques to help assess desirability. Next slide. Let's first talk about commercialization. What exactly is commercialization and why is it important? Well, commercialization is a way to move your ideas and innovations forward from the clinical lab to clinical impact. This talk is going to focus on commercialization, but we realize that there are other mechanisms as well, such as open source and other types of partnerships. But this particular talk will focus more on the market research, the market understanding of commercialization, and utilizing the marketplace as that mechanism to move your technologies or products into the market and into clinical impact. Next slide. As we think about multiple paths to market, there are various ways that you can get and utilize the marketplace. If you click to the next animation, many people are very familiar with the concept of starting your own company, and people have different appetites as to whether or not they're comfortable doing that. Note that starting a new venture, starting a new company, that's just one path to get to the marketplace. If you click 2 more animations, there are other ways to consider getting to the marketplace, one of which would be utilizing commercialization partners, whether it's via joint venture or some type of strategic license, strategic alliance, excuse me. And if you go to the next 2, there's also that option, as I mentioned, to license your technology or sell it. Many of you who are viewing this webinar are calling in from universities, and you have the support of your technology transfer office. There are other folks that are here today that are calling in from perhaps a small business or a large business, but realize that there's various ways to utilize that marketplace, whether it's licensing, sales, or that partnership component that we described earlier. Next slide. I'd like to pause and introduce you to something known as TRLs, or technology readiness levels. Many of you might be familiar with this. This is a structured method to estimate the maturity of a particular technology or innovation. This was developed by NASA in the 1970s and 80s to assess what is that technical maturity of a specific space technology. But it is now applied to other types of innovations as well. It's often used to assess and help make decisions related to funding, transition of technologies, or perhaps even assessing the risk management of a technology based off of their technical milestones. There are primarily 9 TRL levels, with 1 being the lowest and 9 being the highest. Next slide. But true successful commercialization requires more than just technology readiness. Just be ready, I'm going to be asking you to type in your Zoom chat over to the right. Some of you might have heard of this iceberg analogy in the past. When you see an iceberg on the surface of the water, you might see a large protrusion from the water. And in reality, below the surface, there's a lot of other things that are going on that makes that iceberg based off of location, based off of everything. So there's a lot of things below the surface. I'd love for you to type in the Zoom box, what other things beyond technical milestones is important in order for it to be a successful product. Feel free to type in the chat. And remember, we're not looking at technical milestones. Thank you. And I do see Kim, great comment here in terms of your team, what type of team you have. I see Meenakshi had mentioned clinical research. That's great, related to the clinical studies, accessibility, pricing, IP protection, and regulatory. Those are great things. So it sounds like this audience really, truly understands it's beyond the technology readiness levels. Thank you for your input. Next slide. So let's take a moment to discuss something called the DFV framework. D stands for desirability, F stands for feasibility, and V for viability. The DFV framework is a well-known innovation framework that describes various elements that needs to be achieved in order to achieve a successful innovation. So that intersection, that nexus between desirability, feasibility, and viability is where you should strive to overcome or achieve. In terms of feasibility, that's very much like what we've been describing in terms of the technology readiness level, the different milestones. In a nutshell, is this possible? Is this technology or innovation possible? The other component over to the bottom is viability. And viability can mean multiple things, especially in the medical application construct. It could mean reimbursement. Who is willing to pay? Have you thought about that? It could mean the regulatory approval status. Would the FDA or other regulatory bodies approve such a medical application or innovation? It could mean IP or intellectual property protection. Today's focus is primarily going to be on desirability. Next slide. Many of you might be familiar with the story about MRIs in the pediatric population. The MRI technology is a relatively old technology, and there has been a lot of industrial engineers that really seeks to understand how can the MRI machines be less intimidating to the pediatric community. You might have seen some beautiful photos of MRI machines or other type of scanning machines where there's just beautiful photos of the sea or the ocean, space, and other amazing things that really captivates children. And use that example to illustrate that the MRI technology has been in existence, but the true challenge was the desirability of the end users, in this case, the pediatric patient or their families. And how might we think about bigger picture beyond the technology to solicit end users and excitement into the technology. Next slide. As we think about desirability, it's extremely important to understand what are the potential impacts on your potential users. Many innovators that I speak with and technical teams might say, I'm not really thinking about commercialization yet. I don't think I really need to think about desirability. I just need to achieve my technical milestones. And I urge you, think about it sooner rather than later. It's very important to just understand as a whole, certain things like what are those pain points? What does the market need? How might you test that value proposition? And I'll get into what value proposition means later on in the hour, as well as thinking about what are those adoption drivers? Who are the key medical stakeholders that are required in order to adopt such a new innovation or technology, as well as how does that impact clinical workflow? There are various goals that you might need to answer in terms of desirability, and just keep that in mind as you shape your innovation and your ideas. Next slide. As we think of desirability, I'm referencing a variety of medical stakeholders, anywhere from the physicians themselves that can serve as your clinical champions, or those who might be the bedside nurses or technicians that would actually be the users of the technology, as well as industry people too. As we think about commercialization or a potential licensee or a potential manufacturing partner, it's very critical to understand big picture, what are my industry partners thinking about? One of my favorite ways of doing this is looking at relevant associations and groups and what the hot topics are related to that industry or that field. Beyond that, it's the health systems, perhaps it's the patients themselves, the payers, the manufacturers, as I mentioned earlier. Each medical stakeholder can shape or influence whether or not your innovation will be adopted and into practice. So it's nice to make sure that you think about what those medical stakeholders are thinking about at an early stage. Next slide. So we discussed a little bit about desirability and why it's important. At this point, I'd love to introduce you to that ICANVAS framework. Next slide. Another way to look at commercial readiness is using this ICANVAS framework. So what exactly is ICANVAS? This is a tool that RTI has developed that comprehensively and visually assesses and communicates not only the technology maturity, but just the commercial readiness of technology-based innovations. This was developed using over 50 years of commercialization experience, and it provides that framework of various commercialization considerations. It is, in a sense, a maturity model that's not necessarily linear, but is used to serve as a communication tool to describe what is your current state right now, as well as help you determine what could your next steps be, as well as build that strategy as to where you might want to invest your time and your resources. It is a tool that draws from the NASA TRL scale that you saw earlier on in the talk, but it introduces five additional facets for consideration. If you go to the next two animations, Patrick, you'll see that there are additional versions of ICANVAS. We have a very general one for novel research technologies, but there's also two other medical applications in case you are interested, one for medical device and IVDs, in vitro diagnostics, as well as for drugs and biologics. Please feel free to contact the Catalyze Center or myself if you'd like access to this ICANVAS to assess your technology. If you go to the next slide, we'll start talking about those 6 criteria a bit at a high level, but then more deeply into one of these facets. So we talked a bit already about TRL, technology readiness, but with medical applications, as you can imagine, there is a regulatory component that lines up with technology readiness and testing. Someone earlier on in the chat had mentioned the importance of inventors in the team, as well as other components that you might want to consider, such as development resources or IP or intellectual property, as well as understanding market fit and business strategy. We will start to dissect these 6 facets in the next few slides, but primarily at a high level. We won't necessarily get into the finer details, but we can provide you next steps as to how you might want to access ICANVAS if you're interested in using that to review your innovation. Next slide. Oh, if you go to the previous one, Patrick. In terms of market fit, it's another way to describe desirability, which is the main focus of today's talk. So go ahead and move on to that next one, please. So at a really high level, we had talked about technology readiness and regulatory status. For medical applications, not only does it mean the technology stage, but the regulatory approvals, perhaps also the manufacturing status as well. Previous Catalyze skills development seminars spoke to the regulatory and manufacturing components. So if that's an area of interest for your further development, there are recordings on the NHLBI website for you to view those past seminars. Next slide. In terms of your inventor/team status, yes, of course, we want to make sure that you have the technology and technical experts, but specifically for medical applications, ask yourself, do you have clinical internal team members that really understand the clinical application of what you're trying to create, as well as industry experience and business experience? When we speak about industry and business, there's a couple of components below that. It could mean running a business in terms of business operations, or it might mean the commercialization side. This team that we're describing can be both internal experts. For example, is the inventor part of this team that's pushing this technology development forward? Or it could be external partners, whether it is accelerated program partners, or in the case of an academic institute, it could be the tech transfer office. In the case of a corporate organization, that might be your strategy leadership team, or what I like to call the pre-product development strategy group. I had mentioned that my background is also with the RTI Innovation Advisors, and this is an area that we serve in terms of complementing complementing technical teams in terms of better understanding what that market opportunities are. Next slide. Really quickly, in terms of intellectual property, this is a very critical component in terms of understanding and evaluating the way you move your invention or innovation forward. Many people think about patenting as a form of IP, but there are other ways as well, including copyright, trade secret, or trademarks. Oftentimes you might have access to a patent attorney that can help you walk through that, or the technology transfer office might be able to connect you to that as well. One of the earliest steps, especially for an academic institute, is to make sure that you submit that invention disclosure. Next slide. At a high level, development resources means various things. It could mean the funding or the facilities that you use in terms of development or testing or manufacturing. But certainly it's an ongoing process that requires investment from internal and outside parties as well. And then the next piece is business strategy. So how do you define that path to market? Business strategy in and of itself can speak to that pathway to get to market, or if you're in a company, just making sure that you understand what is that go-to market strategy that you might perceive to be a way to attract commercial interest. Most academic PIs will be at an earlier stage of this particular column. And if you look at the next slide, we'll focus also on market fit. The rest of this seminar will be focused on market fit. So finding what are those market opportunities? What are the challenging pieces of technology commercialization? We'll focus primarily here in the next couple of slides to dissect that with you. And I'm gonna ask that towards the end of this particular slide to do a Zoom chat again. Market fit, as you can imagine, really involves understanding that external environment. Do you understand the market? And that might be based off of secondary research and understanding. What is the market size? Do you know who your customers are? And who are your competitors? And what do they have to offer? I'd love for each of you to type in on a scale of 1 to 5, how often do you regularly speak with non-technical stakeholders? So in this case, your customers or competitors or potential partners. With 1 being never, you've only focused on in-lab or technical conversations, versus 5, you speak with stakeholders who are not part of your technology team on a daily basis. I'll give a couple of seconds for you to type in 1 through 5. So I see a 2 in the chat. Great, I see a couple of 5s and 3s. That's great. I'm seeing at least 2 people indicating 3. So that's great that you have some type of interaction with the external market. Next slide, Patrick. The next component of market fit speaks to developing and vetting your value proposition. And we'll get into the how of doing that in a little bit, but it's very important to expose external stakeholders, which could be your customers or other relevant players within your ecosystem, to the innovation and test it early. So that entails developing your value proposition, talking to your potential customers, especially the people who are less familiar with what potential value is your innovation could be. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. The last series of market fit involves truly developing and executing on that strategy to capture your market. So positioning what your innovation could look like. Perhaps you're fully testing the end product with stakeholders, gather and monitoring feedback. All of this is an iterative process and can influence current and future development of your technology as well. Next slide. So at this point, we've spoken about the importance of desirability, as well as provide you with a very brief introduction to ICANVAS. Before we get into the how, I'd like to pause to see if there's any questions that we have in terms of the participants for anything that we've covered thus far. Feel free to type that in the chat box, or if it's easier and more comfortable, feel free to unmute yourself at this time to ask any specific questions. And I don't see or hear any questions, so we can move on. Feel free to type in the chat if you do think of something. So the next piece is related to how to do that assessment of desirability. We talked about value proposition a couple of times. Let's dive in a bit deeper into what that means. So what exactly is the value proposition? It describes the value of your product, your service, or your innovation to either your future or potential, or even your current customer. Some of you might be familiar with the group strategizer that has developed a very handy template to help you design what that value proposition looks like, looking at things like pain points and gains and losses of certain things. So if you are new to the value proposition design, I encourage you to look up that resource. There's an official book, but also there's templates that you can find online as well. And it helps you brainstorm various components to what your innovation is. At a high level, if you go to the next slide, Patrick, here's a generic template that you can use to begin drafting your value proposition. In a way, it's similar to the game Mad Libs, where there is a template and the exercise is filling in the blanks. So you would start with a template similar to this and fill in those blanks. So that first blank is describing what is your product or service or innovation, who can it help, whether it's the end user, end customer, or another relevant stakeholder. What does that stakeholder want to do and achieve? And then in the next couple of blanks, it's related to how does your product or innovation or service function? What does it do? Whether it's reducing something negative or avoiding something, or perhaps it's a more positive twist in terms of improvement of something. And then the last piece, and this speaks to understanding your competition, unlike blank. Perhaps it's the current state of the art, perhaps it's a direct competitor. Note that when you develop your value propositions, you might have multiple types of value propositions depending on who your audience is. If you go to the next slide, you'll see just a very generic example of something that you might start out with to convey value to your end user. In this case, perhaps you're speaking to a patient or caregiver stakeholder. We help patients and their caregivers obtain the proper treatment faster by better monitoring symptoms and identifying anomalies sooner rather than later. Now, this could be a draft proposition for many things, but it's a start. You can see it defines who you're helping, what you're doing, and how. Next slide. Now that you've developed your first value proposition, think of it as a hypothesis, and the final version of your value proposition will change, and it will depend on multiple iterations of this process. So developing it, and then also utilizing various things, whether it's secondary research or interviewing relevant stakeholders. As we think about secondary resources, secondary research should lay a foundation for what you know in the market. So for example, you might access market research reports, but don't stop there. Those are generally very much at a high level. You might also look at patent searches, whether you're doing it yourself and just scouring the web to understand what patents exist, or utilizing patent attorneys who do patent searches often. But a lot of times you can look at patents to understand the trends in technology, understand the market leaders based on who the applicants are, as well as the competitors. Another useful resource is the university or federal lab portals, which highlight a lot of the emerging technologies, as well as SBIR, STTR sites, to understand what are these small businesses doing in terms of spending their research dollars to better improve. One of my two favorite pieces of information is looking at company press releases and announcements, whether they're startups or larger companies, as well as making sure that you understand what associations exists in the industry that you're seeking to get into. This by far is one of my favorites, to really understand who might you want to talk to in that industry as key thought leaders. So these are just a sample of different resources that you might want to use in terms of your secondary research. Next slide. And the biggest piece here in terms of thinking about desirability and market fit is picking up the phone or going somewhere in terms of understanding what the perspectives are from the external stakeholders. So you might want to do interviews, whether it's through Zoom or by phone, or in a non-COVID world in person, in speaking with various key opinion leaders. If you go to the next animations, these key opinion leaders or KOLs generally have an influence in the field that they're in, whether they are clinical champions. If you go next, it could be the physicians themselves, it could be the nurses, it could be the technicians, but a key component too is also talking to the patient and caregivers. The case study example that I'd had in terms of the MRI machines and the pediatric populations, that idea to do that by that industrial designer really honed in on the fact that a lot of pediatric patients were very scared of going into these big looking, scary, dominating machines. So thinking about that perspective is also a key element. In addition to the patient and caregivers, you might also want to talk to the health systems and hospital administrators, whether they are the committees within these health systems that assess whether or not a new technology should be used in their health system, or the hospital administrators, as well as the payers, both from the public and private side. So just think broadly as you think about who are the medical stakeholders or experts that you might want to reach out to sooner rather than later. Why would you want to do primary research? Well, various reasons, and there's 5 reasons listed here, but I could spend even more time talking about that. Talking to experts, talking to medical stakeholders really allows you to leverage their expertise and perspective beyond your own team. It can either verify or validate your research and analysis, verify or validate your hypothesis in terms of your value proposition, or it might make you want to pivot. And it's better to pivot sooner rather than later. It's also a really nice way to get up to date and specific insights that isn't necessarily found in secondary resources like market research reports, which usually comes out on an annual basis on average. Also, by making those connections within your network, you get a chance to tap out of that network and talk to other key stakeholders. One of my favorite questions to ask primary research interviewees is, who else should I be talking to? And once again, this helps to confirm or challenge your original hypotheses. Primary research is very powerful, and I can't emphasize that enough. Next slide. Now, I won't go through all of these bullets, but here are a couple of example questions that you might want to ask. And you might phrase your questions a bit different depending on who you're trying to reach, who you're talking to, or the type of feedback that you're trying to elicit for your innovation. Anywhere from, how does this impact your clinical workflow? What tools exist right now? What are the gaps and challenges? What are the competing products perhaps? Or if you want to take it more of an angle as to, what is your direct assessment of this innovation or idea that I have? And what are the potential barriers to entry? But the list can go on and on. We typically advise to develop something that we call an interview guide, which is not necessarily a one-to-one survey set of questions that you ask, but really helps guide the conversation to the people that you're talking to. And then next slide. A really critical piece outside of having those conversations is making sure that you capture and analyze your feedback and findings. A common tool that people often use is a SWOT analysis. It gives you that framework to look internally in terms of what your innovation is, what your team looks like, as well as externally. So if you think about ICANVAS, which is on the next slide, it really goes hand in hand in terms of what are the things that we heard in terms of feedback as well as secondary research, and how does that impact my strategy going forward? Next slide. We had mentioned ICANVAS a couple of times in terms of the framework, and as you can imagine, depending on where you are at, not only on the TRL level, but in the other facets of ICANVAS, your ICANVAS, if your innovation were to be assessed, could look very differently depending on whether or not you're an academic institute that just submitted an invention disclosure, or perhaps you've done some early testing on that invention, or perhaps you're a small business or a startup as well. The visual here doesn't quite emphasize this, but ICANVAS is not necessarily a linear process. It really is a guide to help you think about all the different elements if you want to have commercialization be one of your goals. And next slide, this is one of the final slides. And this captures the do's and don'ts of what we would recommend for you to do. If you go to the next animation, just as a reminder to summarize the how-to component of assessing desirability, do draft a value proposition, but also at the same time, don't be afraid to change it. You'll learn the more you speak with different primary market research experts, medical key stakeholders, that your value proposition might change. And it's so much better to do it sooner rather than later based off of that feedback that you receive. Second animation. Also consider various secondary resources, but really use that to build your hypothesis or foundation of your hypotheses, but definitely don't stop at doing the secondary research. Continue on, speak with relevant case stakeholders. If you go to the next animation, it's really important to talk outside of your immediate network. But what's really important is when you do that, make sure you're not disclosing anything confidential, especially when you don't have the proper IP protection in place. Also, as I mentioned in an earlier slide, make sure that you capture and analyze your findings. One of the best practices that I have is make sure that you take a look at who you spoke with, document the date, and do it right away, because a lot of the intel that you gather from your conversations can be somewhat anecdotal, but if you capture it, it starts to build a story. But also at the same time, don't assume that once you get 15 interviews done, 5 interviews done, that you're done. The market is constantly changing. So don't assume that you just do it and it's one and done. It's a matter of making sure that you're continually assessing the market. And then the next piece is consider enlisting help from either internal or external partners. In the case of Catalyze PIs, the Catalyze Coordinating Center through RTI International can be your partner to help you do that, as well as make sure that you don't underestimate that value of unbiased assessments. I've spoken with various innovator teams about whether or not we should disclose who and what that technology is owned, or excuse me, who that technology is owned by, and whether or not we should pull those innovators in on those conversations. And honestly, by pulling in partners to help with that assessment, you're getting a lot of more honest feedback from external experts and medical stakeholders that they might not have said things directly if the innovator was present. So just make sure that you consider whether or not a third-party partner will be an asset to your exploration. And then other things that's not on this slide deck or on that slide specifically is just make sure you're looking at other components of ICANVAS, whether it's about your team, your market, your IP, business strategy, and other pieces. And then the last slide is really inviting you to reach out to us in case you'd like more information. If you realize that you need help assessing desirability in your innovation, or if you have interest in taking ICANVAS and using that framework to assess your innovation, please feel free to contact the Catalyze Coordinating Center, whether you're a Catalyze PI or not. We'll make sure that we get your outreach to the right people. And with that, that wraps up this seminar, and would love to open up the door for any questions. Also, Patrick has typed in a link to the survey. Would love to get your feedback in terms of how helpful this was, but then also open up the door of any questions that might be here with the audience members today. And I see, Kim, thank you for putting the Catalyze link also in the chat box as well. Thank you, Susan. No problem, still on mute. Thank you for your message, Meenakshi and Susan. I appreciate your feedback. Please make sure if you have that time to spend some time in that feedback survey and let us know how you did, how we did. Once again, we have that Catalyze email address on your view as well. If you'd like to learn more about ICANVAS or desirability assessments, whether you'd like a partner to do it or how to do it, please don't hesitate to reach out to us.
So thank you, Moline. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat or Q&A and no hands raised. So at this time, we'll conclude the webinar. But please do take a minute to fill out the brief feedback survey. And we all thank you for your attendance. Have a good day. Thanks, Moline.
Thank you, everyone.